I remember the exact sound my ribs made when they shattered against the marble floor. It wasn't a loud crack, but a sickening crunch that echoed in the foyer of the home I had paid for. Above me, standing at the top of the stairs, was the woman who pushed me. Beside her stood my husband, watching me bleed out onto the imported Italian tiles. He didn't call an ambulance. He didn't scream. He just let out a heavy sigh, as if my murder was merely a scheduling conflict. When I closed my eyes for the last time, I swore to whoever was listening that I would make them pay. I just didn't expect to wake up 3 years in the past with the perfect opportunity to do it. The first thing I registered was the smell. Expensive lavender and the sharp metallic tang of Beatrice's signature perfume, Chanel No. 19. It was a scent that in my previous life had triggered immediate anxiety, signaling the arrival of my mother-in-law and the beginning of another session of relentless psychological torment. I gasped, my hands flying to my chest, expecting to feel the jagged edge of a broken rib piercing my lung. Instead, my fingers brushed against smooth, unblemished skin encased in silk. I was breathing. My heart was beating with a steady, frantic rhythm against my ribs. I blinked, the blurry shapes of the room snapping into focus. I was sitting at the long mahogany dining table in the Sterling family estate in Kensington Grove. The crystal chandelier above cast a warm, deceptive glow over the spread of roasted pheasant and truffled asparagus. Honestly, Clara, a woman of your supposed pedigree, should know that serving a burgundy with white meat is a vulgarity. Beatrice's voice sliced through my disorientation like a scalpel. But then again, your father made his money in shipping, didn't he? Blue-collar roots are so difficult to bleach out. I froze. The memory hit me with the force of a freight train. It was the summer of 2023. We had been married for exactly 3 months. This was the infamous welcome to the family dinner, the exact night the abuse shifted from passive-aggressive comments to overt systemic humiliation. In my past life, this was the moment I broke. I had spent hours preparing the meal, desperate for Beatrice's approval. When she insulted my late father, I had burst into tears, stammering apologies, while my husband Arthur sat beside me and sighed. "Don't be so sensitive, Clara," he had murmured back then, not even looking up from his phone. "Mother is just trying to help you refine your tastes. Stop embarrassing me." That night had set the precedent. I became the hysterical, insecure wife. They became my patient, long-suffering superiors. They chipped away at my sanity, gaslit me into believing I was crazy, and slowly drained my family's trust fund to keep the failing Sterling group afloat. And when the money ran out, Vivian arrived and they threw me away. Literally, down a flight of marble stairs. "Clara, are you deaf as well as uncultured?" Beatrice snapped, rapping her silver fork against her crystal wine glass. Arthur placed a warm, heavy hand on my knee under the table. His touch, once a source of comfort, now made my skin crawl with revulsion. "Darling," he said, his voice dripping with that patronizing velvet tone I used to mistake for love. "Apologize to Mother. You're ruining the evening." I looked at Arthur. Really looked at him. The dimples that had charmed me, the tailored Tom Ford suit bought with my inheritance, the icy blue eyes that would one day watch me die without a shred of pity. The old Clara would have cried. The old Clara would have begged for forgiveness. But the old Clara died on the floor of the foyer. I was something else now. A ghost wrapped in a living woman's skin. I didn't cry. I didn't apologize. I didn't even frown. I simply turned my head, picked up my napkin, and dabbed the corner of my mouth. Then I looked directly into Beatrice's eyes and held her gaze. I let the silence stretch. 1 second, 2 seconds, 5 seconds. The dining room grew unnervingly quiet. The clinking of silverware stopped. Beatrice's smug expression faltered, a flicker of confusion crossing her heavily Botoxed forehead. People hate silence. It forces them to sit with the weight of their own words. "Well?" Beatrice demanded, though her voice had lost a fraction of its bite. I smiled. It was a cold, empty thing that didn't reach my eyes. "Would you prefer I have the staff clear your plate, Beatrice? Since the pairing has offended you so deeply, I wouldn't want you to force it down." Arthur's hand tightened on my knee, his nails digging into my skin. "Clara," he warned in a low whisper. "No, Arthur." I said, my voice perfectly level, carrying clearly across the room. "Beatrice is right. I am my father's daughter, and my father always taught me never to consume anything that leaves a bitter taste in your mouth. Isn't that right, Beatrice?" I signaled the maid, a young woman named Maria, who would later be fired for trying to sneak me food when Arthur locked me in my room. "Maria, please take Mrs. Sterling's plate away. She won't be eating. I never said—" Beatrice started, her face flushing an ugly mottled red. "You didn't have to," I interrupted softly, rising from my chair. "Excuse me, I suddenly have a terrible headache." I didn't wait for Arthur's permission. I didn't wait for the explosion. I turned my back on them and walked out of the dining room, my heels clicking methodically on the hardwood. I didn't storm off. I glided. As I climbed the stairs, the very stairs that had been my deathbed in another timeline, I felt a strange, intoxicating thrill blooming in my chest. They expected a victim. They expected tears, arguments, and dramatic exits that they could use to paint me as unhinged. But you can't fight a war against someone who refuses to raise their voice. You can't gaslight a shadow. My silence wasn't a retreat. It was the drawing of the battle lines. And this time, I held the pen. Arthur didn't come up to the master bedroom for another 2 hours. When he finally opened the heavy oak door, I was already in bed reading a copy of The Art of War, a book my father had given me years ago that I had previously used only as a decorative piece on a bookshelf. Arthur took off his tie, throwing it carelessly over an armchair. He was waiting for me to speak. He was waiting for the frantic apologies, the desperate need for his validation. In the past, I would have been out of bed the second the door clicked, wrapping my arms around him, begging him not to be mad at me. I turned a page, the crisp rustle of the paper loud in the quiet room. "What exactly was that stunt downstairs?" Arthur finally asked, pouring himself a glass of scotch from the crystal decanter on the sideboard. He didn't look at me. He was playing the disappointed patriarch, a role he relished. "I had a headache," I said calmly, not looking up from the book. "You humiliated my mother." He shot back, his voice rising, trying to provoke me into an emotional response. "You practically starved her because she gave you a piece of constructive criticism. You're acting like a petulant child, Clara." I closed the book, marking my place with a silk ribbon, and finally looked at him. In my past life, his disapproval felt like a physical blow. Now, looking at his flushed face and the vein throbbing slightly at his temple, I just felt a profound sense of disgust. He was so incredibly transparent. If Maria clearing a plate is enough to humiliate a woman of Beatrice's formidable standing, then her standing is quite fragile, wouldn't you agree? I asked gently. Arthur paused, his glass halfway to his lips. He blinked, clearly thrown off balance by the even tone of my voice. I wasn't defensive. I wasn't hysterical. I was merely stating a fact. That's not the point, he snapped, taking a large gulp of the amber liquid. The point is your attitude. You've been manic lately. First you obsess over this dinner, and then you snap. Maybe Mother is right. Maybe you need to see Dr. Faber. A mild sedative, perhaps. Dr. Henrik Faber. The name sent a shard of ice into my veins. In my past life, Arthur had forced me to see Dr. Faber, a corrupt psychiatrist on the Sterling Group's payroll. Faber had diagnosed me with severe hysterical anxiety and prescribed me a cocktail of pills that left me docile, foggy, and unable to manage my own affairs, giving Arthur the perfect legal excuse to take control of my trust fund. I am perfectly fine, Arthur. I said, my voice a soft, soothing purr. I patted the empty space beside me on the mattress. Come to bed. You're stressing yourself out over nothing. He stared at me, searching my face for the familiar cracks of instability. Finding none, he seemed unnerved. He finished his drink in silence, stripped, and got into bed. He turned his back to me, expecting me to reach out and spoon him to bridge the physical gap he was imposing as punishment. I turned off my bedside lamp, rolled over to face the opposite wall, and closed my eyes. Within minutes, I heard him shifting restlessly. He was the one squirming now. The next morning, Arthur left for the office early, leaving a curt note on the kitchen counter. I didn't care. I had work to do. By 9 a.m., I was stepping out of an Uber in front of a sleek, glass-fronted building in the financial district. I wasn't visiting the Sterling family lawyers. I was here to see Alistair Finch. Alistair was a bulldog of an attorney, an old friend of my father's, who had warned me against marrying Arthur. He has hungry eyes, Clara Alistair had said on my wedding day. And the Sterlings are a family of wolves. I had ignored him drunk on Arthur's manufactured charm. After the wedding, Arthur had convinced me to move all my legal affairs to his family's firm, claiming it was more efficient. Clara, Alistair said, standing up from behind his massive oak desk as I was ushered into his office. He looked older than I remembered, or perhaps I just hadn't been paying attention. This is a surprise. I assumed the Sterlings had built a moat around you by now. They tried, I said, taking a seat across from him. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. Alistair, I need you to run a shadow audit on the Hayes Family Trust, immediately. Alistair's bushy eyebrows shot up. An audit, Clara, you handed Arthur power of attorney over the operational investments just last month. Have you found something? I don't need to find something, Alistair. I know it's there. I lied smoothly. I couldn't exactly tell him I knew Arthur was embezzling millions to cover up the Sterling Group's toxic debts, because I had lived through the bankruptcy it caused 2 years from now. I want to revoke his power of attorney, quietly. I don't want him notified until the paperwork is airtight and the assets are frozen in a holding account he can't access. Alistair leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. He studied my face, looking for the naive, lovesick girl he had spoken to 3 months ago. Whatever he saw in my eyes made him nod slowly. It will take some maneuvering to do it without triggering an alert to his lawyers, Alistair said, pulling a yellow legal pad toward him. But if we cite a restructuring for tax purposes offshore, we might blindside them. Do it, I said. And Alistair dig into a woman named Vivian Croft. She runs a boutique PR firm downtown. I want to know every financial connection she has to the Sterling Group and to Arthur personally. Alistair paused his writing. Vivian Croft. Who is she? Arthur's childhood friend. I said the words, tasting like ash in my mouth. In reality, she was the woman who had been sharing his bed for the last 5 years, the woman who would eventually convince him that throwing me down the stairs was the easiest way to solve their financial problems. And my replacement, I added softly, almost to myself. Alistair's expression hardened. He didn't ask questions. He just started writing. "Leave it to me, Clara. I'll tear their ledgers apart." I left the office feeling the first true breath of air in my lungs since I woke up in this timeline. The trap was set. Now I just had to wait for them to walk into it. The Sterling Charity Gala was the crown jewel of Beatrice's social calendar. Held annually at the Grand Atrium, it was a sickening display of wealth where the city's elite paid tens of thousands of dollars a plate to pretend they cared about the homeless while secretly brokering backroom deals. In my previous life, this night had been a slaughter. It was the night Vivian Croft was formally introduced to me. Arthur had insisted I wear a custom emerald green silk gown he had personally selected. When we arrived, Vivian was there wearing the exact same gown. The socialites had whispered, laughed behind their hands. Later that evening, Vivian had tripped, spilling an entire glass of red wine down my front. I had run to the bathroom crying while Arthur stayed behind, laughing with her and apologizing to the guests for his wife's fragile nerves. Not tonight. As I sat at my vanity, Maria zipped up my dress. It wasn't the emerald green monstrosity Arthur had laid out on the bed. That dress was currently wadded up in a trash bag in the basement. Instead, I wore a vintage midnight blue velvet gown with a neckline that was elegant, yet severe, paired with my mother's diamond choker. It was a dress that commanded respect, not attention. Arthur walked into the bedroom, struggling with his cufflinks. He stopped dead when he saw me. "What are you wearing?" he demanded, a flash of genuine anger in his eyes. "Where is the green silk I explicitly ordered it for tonight?" "It didn't fit right." I lied smoothly, spraying a mist of Tom Ford Black Orchid, a heavy dominant scent that would overpower Beatrice's Chanel. The zipper caught. "This is much more appropriate for a charity event. Don't you think green is so flashy?" Arthur ground his jaw. He hated when his stage direction was ignored. "Go change. Find something else. You are not wearing that." I stood up, walking slowly toward him. I reached out and gently took his wrists, expertly fastening his cufflinks for him. I didn't look at his eyes. I focused entirely on the gold medal. "Arthur, darling, we are going to be late. The press will be taking photos of Beatrice's arrival in exactly 20 minutes. Do you really want to be the reason your mother's grand entrance is delayed?" I knew his pressure points. Beatrice's wrath was the only thing Arthur feared more than losing money. He swallowed hard, his eyes darting to the Rolex on his wrist. "Fine," he spat, snatching his hands away. "But you will stay by my side tonight. No more stunts like the dinner." "Of course," I smiled. "I wouldn't dream of leaving your side." When we arrived at the Grand Atrium, the flashbulbs were blinding. I kept my face a mask of serene perfection, holding Arthur's arm, lightly offering the cameras nothing but the picture of a devoted aristocratic wife. We navigated the sea of tuxedos and gowns, shaking hands with senators and CEOs. And then I saw her, Vivian Croft. She was standing near the champagne fountain, holding court with a group of Arthur's frat brothers. She was wearing the emerald green silk gown. In my past life, seeing her in that dress had triggered a wave of agonizing insecurity. Now I saw it for what it was, a cheap high school mean girl tactic, executed by a deeply unoriginal woman. Arthur stiffened beside me. He had seen her too. He looked down at me, bracing himself for the meltdown he had orchestrated. "Arthur, Clara." Vivian called out, her voice a shrill bell-like chime that grated against my eardrums. She glided over to us, her eyes locked on my midnight blue dress. For a microsecond, her smile faltered. She had been expecting the twin dress humiliation. "Vivian." Arthur said, his voice a little too thick, a little too warm. You look stunning. Thank you, she purred, finally turning her predatory gaze to me. Clara, so wonderful to finally meet you. Arthur talks about you all the time. All good things, I hope, I said, my voice completely devoid of inflection. I didn't extend my hand. I just looked at her. Vivian laughed, a forced tinkling sound. Oh, mostly. He says you're quite the homebody. I was worried you might not make it out tonight. Large crowds can be so overwhelming for delicate constitutions. It was a blatant insult wrapped in fake concern. Arthur chuckled nervously, stepping slightly away from me and closer to Vivian. Clara is doing her best, he murmured, throwing me under the bus instantly. I didn't defend myself. I didn't glare. I simply tilted my head, letting a small, patronizing smile touch my lips, as if I were listening to a toddler babble. I let the silence stretch. I let it hang heavy in the air between the three of us. Vivian shifted her weight, the silence clearly making her uncomfortable. She wasn't used to an opponent who didn't fight back. She needed friction to create her sparks. Well, Vivian said, her smile turning brittle. She reached for a glass of red wine from a passing waiter's tray. Let's toast to the happy couple, shall we? I knew the choreography. This was the moment she would step forward, pretend to catch her heel on the carpet, and dump the Shiraz all over me. I watched the slight tensing of her shoulder, the micro shift of her weight to her front foot. As she lunged forward, feigning a gasp, I didn't jump back. I didn't scream. I simply took a half step to the left, pivoting smoothly on my heel, entirely out of her trajectory. Without my body there to break her fall, Vivian's momentum carried her forward. She pitched violently, slamming right into Mrs. Eleanor Vance. No, wait, Eleanor Gable, the notoriously vicious wife of the city's largest banking magnate, a woman Beatrice had spent months trying to court. The collision was spectacular. Vivian crashed into Eleanor, sending the entire glass of red wine splashing across the older woman's white custom Oscar de la Renta gown. Eleanor shrieked a piercing sound that brought the entire ballroom to a dead halt. Vivian hit the floor in a tangle of green silk, gasping for air. My dress! Eleanor screamed, her face purple with rage, glaring down at Vivian. You clumsy, stupid girl! Are you blind? Arthur froze in horror. The entire room was watching. The cameras from the society pages were flashing rapidly, capturing Vivian sprawled on the floor, covered in wine, looking like a drunken fool. I stood a few feet away, perfectly untouched, perfectly calm. I looked at Arthur, whose face had drained of all color. He was torn between helping his mistress and appeasing the banking magnate's wife. I leaned in close to Arthur's ear, my voice barely a whisper against the chaos. You're right, darling. I breathed, the venom finally lacing my words. Green is entirely too flashy. The car ride back to Kensington Grove was suffocating thick with the stench of Arthur's suppressed rage. He stared out the window of the Bentley, his jaw clenched so tightly I thought his teeth might shatter. I sat beside him, perfectly still, gazing placidly at my own reflection in the darkened glass. You moved! Arthur finally hissed, his voice trembling with a terrifying, barely contained fury. He didn't turn to look at me. You saw her tripping, and you deliberately stepped out of the way. You let her humiliate herself. I was startled. Arthur! I replied, my voice a soft, airy whisper of innocence. I simply lost my footing. Surely you don't expect me to act as a physical barricade for a woman who clearly had too much champagne. Besides, Eleanor Gable is the one who was truly humiliated. Arthur snapped his head toward me, his eyes wild. Eleanor Gable's husband underwrites half the debt for the Sterling Group. Beatrice has spent 6 months kissing the ground. That woman walks on to secure a line of credit and your petty little flinch just destroyed it. He expected me to defend myself. He wanted me to argue to raise my voice so he could call me hysterical, so he could pivot the blame entirely onto my shoulders. That was his favorite tactic, push me to the edge of an emotional cliff and then punish me for falling over. I didn't argue. I reached out my fingers cool against the feverish heat of his clenched fist and gently stroked his knuckles. "I'm so sorry you're stressed, darling," I murmured, staring unblinkingly into his eyes. "Perhaps you should speak to Mother about managing the firm's debts better. It sounds terribly complicated." He yanked his hand away as if I had burned him utterly disarmed by my complete lack of defensiveness. He spent the rest of the ride in a suffocating, impotent silence. The real fallout happened the next morning. I was in the sunroom leisurely sipping Earl Grey tea and reading the society pages, which prominently featured a sprawling, full-color photograph of Vivian Croft on the floor, covered in wine beneath a shrieking Eleanor Gable, when Beatrice stormed through the front doors. "Arthur, Arthur, get down here this instant!" Beatrice's voice echoed off the marble foyer, completely devoid of its usual aristocratic composure. She sounded like a banshee. Arthur descended the stairs, pale and disheveled. He hadn't slept. "Do you know what Richard Gable told me on the phone this morning?" Beatrice screamed, waving a rolled-up newspaper at her son. "He told me that the Sterling Group is officially a liability. He is pulling the bridging loan. We have 30 days to cover the shortfall, or we are in default." "Mother, please keep your voice down," Arthur pleaded, glancing nervously toward the sunroom where he knew I was sitting. "Don't you tell me to keep my voice down, who brought that cheap, clumsy tramp to my gala?" Beatrice demanded. "Vivian Croft, I know you've been entertaining her, Arthur. Don't think I am blind to your extracurriculars. But to bring her to my event, to let her ruin my relationship with the Gables," I took a slow, deliberate sip of my tea. In my past life, discovering Beatrice knew about Vivian all along would have broken my heart. It would have sent me into a spiral of agonizing betrayal. Now, it was just another piece of leverage. They were a family of vipers perfectly content to let each other bite as long as the venom didn't spill on the carpets. "She is a PR consultant, Mother. It was a business invitation?" Arthur lied, his voice cracking. "She is a liability," Beatrice roared. "Fix this, Arthur. If we lose the Gable financing, the board will look into the offshore accounts. And if they look into the offshore accounts, we are both going to prison." I froze, the teacup hovering an inch from my lips. Prison. That was new. In my previous timeline, I had died before the Sterling Group's ultimate collapse. I knew Arthur was embezzling from my trust to cover his debts, but I hadn't realized the rot went so deep that Beatrice was actively engaged in criminal fraud to keep the company afloat. My phone buzzed in my lap. A text from Alistair Finch. "The trap is set. Hayes Trust is locked in a blind holding account. Prescott LLC is frozen. We have them." I smiled, a genuine, terrifying smile that stretched across my face. I stood up, smoothing the front of my silk robe, and walked out into the foyer. Beatrice stopped yelling immediately, her face flushing, as she tried to compose herself. "Clara, good morning." "Good morning, Beatrice," I said brightly, ignoring the palpable tension in the room. "I couldn't help but overhear. Is everything all right with the business?" "Everything is perfectly fine," Arthur snapped aggressively, straightening his collar. "Just a minor cash flow discrepancy. Nothing you need to trouble your pretty head over." "Oh, good," I sighed, playing the part of the relieved, empty-headed wife to perfection. Because I was just talking to my financial manager and I realized I have absolutely no head for these things. I'm so lucky to have you to handle the heavy lifting, Arthur. I walked past them, my bare feet silent on the marble, leaving them to marinate in the acidic stew of their impending doom. They thought they had 30 days. They didn't even have 3. It started with a declined credit card. 3 days after the gala, Arthur was at a high-end jeweler in Mayfair, attempting to purchase a $60,000 diamond tennis bracelet, a peace offering for Vivian, who had been blowing up his phone with hysterical demands since her public humiliation. I knew this because Alistair had set up a real-time alert for any transaction attempted on the Hayes Trust master account. When the notification popped up on my phone, declined insufficient funds / account frozen. I was sitting in my garden pruning the white roses. I actually laughed out loud, a sharp, bright sound that startled the gardener. 20 minutes later, my phone rang. It was Arthur. I let it ring until it went to voicemail. He called again and again. I silenced the device and went back to my roses. Let him sweat. Let the silence deafen him. When Arthur burst through the front doors of the estate 2 hours later, he looked like a man who had seen a ghost. His tie was loosened, his hair was a mess, and his face was a sickly shade of gray. "Clara," he bellowed, storming into the parlor where I was arranging the cut roses in a crystal vase. "What the hell is going on with the trust accounts? I just spent an hour on the phone with the bank, and they told me my access has been revoked." I didn't look up from the flowers. I carefully snipped a thorn off a stem. Snip. "Clara, look at me when I'm talking to you," he yelled, slamming his hand down on the mahogany table. The vase rattled. I slowly turned my head, my expression a mask of serene, wide-eyed confusion. "Whatever do you mean, Arthur? Have you forgotten the passcode again?" "Don't play dumb with me," he snarled, stepping closer, his physical intimidation tactics kicking in. In the past, this was when I would cower. This was when my heart would race, and I would start apologizing profusely for things I hadn't even done. The bank said the primary signatory was changed. They said Alistair Finch transferred the entire liquid balance into a blind trust. "Did he?" I asked, softly tilting my head. "Oh, that must be part of the restructuring. I told Alistair I was feeling terribly overwhelmed with the paperwork. You know how my anxiety gets, Arthur. Dr. Faber said I need to eliminate stress from my life. I figured letting Alistair handle the tedious legal jargon would free you up to focus on the Sterling Group. You've been so tense lately." Arthur stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. He was trapped in a cage of his own design. He had spent months convincing me, his mother and his doctor, that I was mentally fragile and incapable of handling stress. Now I was using his own psychological warfare against him. He couldn't scream at me for protecting my delicate constitution without admitting that his entire narrative about my mental health was a lie. You gave Alistair control." Arthur stammered, the reality of his financial ruin finally sinking in. The stolen money he needed to cover the Gable loan was gone. "Clara, you need to call him right now. You need to undo this. The company needs that liquidity for a bridging loan." I picked up another rose, examining its petals. "But Arthur, you told me just 3 days ago that the company's finances were perfectly fine. You told me it was a minor cash flow discrepancy and not to trouble my pretty head over it." I looked up, locking my eyes onto his panicked ones. "Were you lying to me, darling?" The silence that followed was exquisite. It was thick, heavy, and absolute. Arthur realized, perhaps for the first time, that he was utterly powerless. He couldn't force me to make the call. He couldn't beat it out of me, and if he admitted he was embezzling, he would be handing me the keys to his own jail cell. I need to make a phone call," he muttered, turning on his heel and fleeing the room. The paranoia set in quickly after that. Without my money to patch the holes in his sinking ship, Arthur began to unravel. He started drinking heavily. He stopped coming home to sleep, crashing in his office downtown, as the creditors began circling like sharks. But the masterpiece of my isolation strategy wasn't just cutting him off from the money. It was cutting him off from his allies. A week later, Vivian Croft showed up at the Kensington estate. She was desperate. Arthur hadn't bought her the bracelet his credit cards were bouncing, and the society pages were still mocking her for the gala incident. She needed a target, and she assumed the meek, fragile wife was still her easiest prey. Maria answered the door, but I was already waiting in the foyer. Vivian pushed past the maid, her eyes wild, her designer coat wrinkled. "Where is he, Clara? Where is Arthur? He's not returning my calls." I stood at the base of the grand staircase, the very staircase where she would have watched me die in another life. I looked at her, really looked at her. She wasn't a sophisticated mastermind. She was just a greedy, desperate woman panicking as her meal ticket evaporated. "Mrs. Croft," I said quietly, my voice echoing slightly in the vast entryway. "You are trespassing." "Don't give me that aristocratic nonsense," Vivian spat, marching toward me. "I know what you're doing. You're trying to freeze him out. You think cutting off his money is going to make him love you? He despises you. He laughs at you, Clara. He tells me how pathetic you are every time he's in my bed." She wanted me to cry. She wanted me to slap her. She wanted a reaction so she could prove to Arthur that I was the monster. I just stared at her. I didn't blink. I didn't move a single muscle. I let the absolute chilling weight of my silence press down on her. "Say something," she screamed, her voice cracking the echo harsh and ugly. "Fight back, you pathetic little mouse." Maria stepped forward, alarmed. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to leave, or I'll call the police." Vivian ignored her, stepping right up to my face. I could smell the stale wine on her breath. "He is going to leave you, and you will have nothing." I finally moved. I raised my hand slowly, deliberately. Vivian flinched, expecting a strike. Instead, I reached out and delicately plucked a piece of white lint off the lapel of her coat. "Maria," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion, never breaking eye contact with Vivian. "Please call the authorities. There is a deranged woman having a psychiatric episode in my foyer, and I fear she might be a danger to herself." Vivian's eyes went wide with sheer terror. She realized in that exact moment that she couldn't break me, because there was nothing left to break. I wasn't fighting a battle she understood. "You're a psychopath," she whispered, backing away slowly, stumbling slightly over her own heels. She turned and fled out the front door before Maria even picked up the phone. I stood at the bottom of the stairs, listening to the frantic screech of her car tires peeling out of the driveway. I ran my hand along the smooth, cold marble of the banister. One down, I thought to myself, the silence wrapping around me like a comforting blanket. 2 to go. Arthur's desperation made him predictable. Deprived of my funds and alienated from his mistress, he resorted to the only play he had left in his playbook, declaring me mentally unfit to manage my own estate. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon when Dr. Henrik Faber arrived at Kensington Grove. Arthur had ambushed me in the library, standing by the fireplace with a stiff posture and a glass of scotch he clearly didn't have the stomach for. Dr. Faber sat opposite him in a wingback leather chair. His legs crossed a silver Patek Philippe watch, gleaming subtly from beneath the cuff of his bespoke suit. In the previous timeline, this meeting had been my breaking point. They had cornered me. Dr. Faber, with his soothing clinical voice, had meticulously twisted every tear, every moment of anxiety, and every plea for affection into a symptom of borderline hysterical pathology. He had handed Arthur the medical proxy on a silver platter. This time, I was the one who poured the tea. "Clara." Arthur began, his voice taking on that sickeningly gentle tone he reserved for an audience. "Dr. Faber is here because I'm worried about you. We're all worried about you. Your erratic behavior, freezing the accounts, firing the staff. You're not yourself." I hadn't fired any staff, but reality was entirely subjective to Arthur right now. I placed a Limoges porcelain teacup gently on the table next to Dr. Faber. I didn't say a word. I just sat down on the velvet sofa, folded my hands in my lap, and looked at the doctor. Faber cleared his throat, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. He had the sharp, predatory look of a man who made his living keeping the dirty secrets of London's elite heavily medicated. "Mrs. Sterling, Arthur has expressed some deep concerns regarding your recent paranoia and aggressive detachment. We want to help you. But to do that, I need to evaluate your cognitive state." I let the silence settle over the room, thick and suffocating, accompanied only by the rhythmic drumming of rain against the window panes. Dr. Faber's polite smile began to strain at the edges. Refusing to communicate is a classic sign of severe withdrawal. Clara Faber prodded, pulling a gold Mont Blanc pen from his breast pocket and opening a leather-bound notepad. "If you won't speak to me, I have no choice but to recommend temporary psychiatric hold and transfer medical and financial proxy to your husband for your own safety." There it was. The guillotine. I smiled. It was a slow, terrifyingly calm smile that made Arthur visibly flinch. I reached into the pocket of my cardigan and pulled out a sleek black USB drive, placing it on the coffee table between us. "I prefer not to speak, Dr. Faber, because I find that paperwork is so much more eloquent," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, smooth as glass. Faber frowned, glancing at Arthur, who looked equally confused. "What is this, Clara?" Arthur snapped. "Just a bit of light reading," I murmured. "My lawyers at Finch & Associates conducted a routine shadow audit of the Sterling accounts. It's amazing what you find when you look closely at the outgoing wire transfers. Specifically, the monthly retainers paid from the Sterling Group's corporate accounts to a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands under the name Aegis Consulting." Faber's pen stopped mid-air. The color drained from his face so fast, he looked as though he might faint. Imagine my surprise. I continued, my tone conversational, as if discussing the weather, when Alistair discovered that Aegis Consulting is wholly owned by a trust in your name, Dr. Faber. £200,000 a year. Quite a hefty sum for a company that seems to provide no actual consulting services. Or perhaps the service you provide is drafting fraudulent medical proxies for wealthy husbands looking to rob their wives. This is absurd, Arthur sputtered, his voice cracking. Mother hired Dr. Faber to consult on the employee wellness program? I ignored Arthur entirely, locking my eyes onto the doctor. I forwarded the findings to the General Medical Council. However, they haven't opened the attachments yet. They won't unless I give the authorization code. Dr. Faber swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. He was a creature of self-preservation. He looked at Arthur, then back at me. He recognized the look in my eyes. It wasn't the look of a hysterical housewife. It was the look of an executioner. You have a choice. Henrik, I said softly, dropping his title. You can sign that proxy, declare me unfit, and I will press a single button on my phone that sends your banking records, your illegal prescriptions for the Mayfair housewives, and your fraudulent diagnoses straight to the Financial Conduct Authority and the police. You will lose your license, your Patek Philippe, and your freedom. I leaned forward, dropping my voice to a lethal purr. Or you can stand up, walk out of my house, and write a sworn affidavit stating that Arthur Sterling attempted to bribe you into falsely diagnosing his perfectly sane wife. Do that, and Aegis Consulting remains our little secret. Don't listen to her, Henrik! Arthur yelled, panic rising in his chest. She's bluffing. The accounts are encrypted. Faber slowly put his Mont Blanc pen back into his pocket. He closed his leather notepad. His hands were shaking. He didn't say a word to Arthur. He just stood up, picked up his briefcase, and walked briskly out of the library, the heavy oak doors clicking shut behind him. Arthur stared at the closed door, his mouth hanging open in utter disbelief. His most powerful weapon had just surrendered without a single shot fired. I picked up my teacup, took a slow, deliberate sip, and looked at my husband over the gold rim. "Checkmate, darling," I whispered. 72 hours later, the 30-day grace period for the Sterling Group's bridging loan expired. The emergency board meeting was called at 8 a.m. sharp on a Friday. The Sterling Group headquarters in Canary Wharf was a monolith of steel and glass, completely devoid of the warmth Beatrice pretended to exude in her social circles. It was a fortress built on debt and deceit, and today I was going to tear it down to the studs. Because the Hayes Family Trust held 20% of the Sterling Group's voting shares, a little detail Arthur had intended to absorb through the medical proxy, I had a guaranteed seat at the table. When I walked into the grand boardroom, the air was thick with the scent of stale coffee and impending doom. 12 men and women in dark suits sat around a massive mahogany table. At the head sat Beatrice, looking 10 years older than she had at the gala. Beside her sat Arthur, nursing a severe hangover, his eyes bloodshot and darting nervously around the room. The murmuring stopped the moment the heavy double doors closed behind me. "Clara," Beatrice hissed, standing up her hands, trembling as they rested on the polished wood. "This is a closed executive session. Shareholders are not permitted unless invited. Actually, Beatrice, as the primary beneficiary of the Hayes Trust, I possess a controlling voting block," I said calmly, taking the only empty seat at the opposite end of the long table. I placed a thick black leather binder on the table in front of me. "And considering the agenda today is bankruptcy, I felt it prudent to attend." A murmur of shock rippled through the board members. Arthur squeezed his eyes shut, massaging his temples. "Bankruptcy is an extreme exaggeration," Beatrice declared, plastering on a fake brittle smile for the board. "We are experiencing a temporary liquidity crisis. Richard Gable overreacted to a minor social faux pas, but I assure you, alternative financing is being secured as we speak." "She's lying," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but in the tense quiet of the boardroom, it cut like a whip. "Clara, that is enough," Arthur snapped, slamming his fist on the table. "Security can escort you out." "Let her speak," interrupted Jonathan Croft, no relation to Vivian, but rather the oldest and most ruthless investor on the board. He looked at me with cold, calculating eyes. "What do you mean she's lying, Mrs. Sterling?" I didn't argue with Arthur. I didn't raise my voice to match Beatrice's frantic energy. I simply opened the black leather binder and slid a stack of 10 manila folders down the length of the polished mahogany table. They glided perfectly, stopping in front of the board members. "If you open those folders, gentlemen, you will find the results of a forensic audit conducted by Finch and Associates over the last 2 weeks. I stated my tone as flat and professional as a Bloomberg terminal reading out a market crash. The sound of opening folders and rustling paper filled the room. "Page 4, I instructed softly. You will see that the liquidity crisis isn't due to the Gable loan being pulled. The Gable loan was pulled because Richard Gable received an anonymous tip from me that Arthur has been embezzling corporate funds for the past 4 years to cover personal debts and extravagant gifts for his mistress. Arthur shot up from his chair. That is a fabrication. This is the raving of a hysterical, jealous woman. Page 7 outlines the exact offshore accounts. I continued ignoring Arthur, completely speaking directly to Jonathan Croft. You'll also notice wire transfers from Beatrice Sterling's executive discretionary fund to Arthur's shell accounts, proving she not only knew about the embezzlement, but actively helped him hide it from the board to protect the family name. Beatrice gasped, clutching her chest. Lies, these documents are forged. Jonathan Croft adjusted his reading glasses, his eyes scanning the ledgers. The silence in the room shifted. It was no longer the silence of anticipation. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of absolute ruin. The numbers were undeniable. The paper trail was flawless. Alistair had done his job perfectly. Arthur. Jonathan said, his voice deadly quiet. He didn't look up from the page. There is a receipt here for a £60,000 diamond bracelet from a jeweler in Mayfair purchased 2 weeks ago, using the firm's operational expense account. Arthur was sweating profusely, his collar completely soaked. Jonathan, I can explain it was a save it for the Financial Conduct Authority, another board member sneered, tossing the folder onto the table in disgust. I sat back in my plush leather chair, watching the empire crumble. In my previous life, Beatrice had stood over me, looking down at my broken body with cold apathy. Arthur had sighed, inconvenienced by my death. They had stolen my money, my sanity, and my life, all while wearing the masks of aristocrats. The board will be calling for an immediate vote of no confidence, Jonathan Croft announced, closing the folder with a sharp thwack. Arthur, Beatrice, you are both removed from your positions effective instantly. Security will escort you to your offices to pack your personal belongings. The company's legal counsel will be contacting the authorities before noon. Beatrice looked like she had been struck by lightning. She looked at the board, then at Arthur, and finally her eyes locked onto me. The sheer, unadulterated hatred in her gaze was something to behold. You, Beatrice whispered, pointing a shaking, manicured finger at me. You did this. You orchestrated all of it. You planned this from the very beginning. Arthur just stared at me, his eyes hollow, finally realizing the depth of the ocean he had drowned in. He had thought I was a puddle he could comfortably step in. I didn't gloat. I didn't smile. I stood up, smoothing the front of my tailored Dior blazer, completely untouched by the debris of their shattered lives. I have no idea what you're talking about, Beatrice, I said, my voice echoing in the dead silence of the boardroom. I'm just a fragile woman with a terrible headache. If you'll excuse me, I really must be getting home. I arrived back at the Kensington Grove estate a full hour before they did. The storm that had been brewing all morning finally broke, sending sheets of freezing rain lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the drawing room. I didn't sit. I walked methodically through the house I had paid for my heels, clicking a steady rhythm on the imported Italian tiles. When I reached the foyer, I stopped at the base of the grand marble staircase. I looked up at the landing. The memory of my ribs shattering of the cold, seeping into my fading consciousness, was a phantom ache in my chest. That was where I had died. Today, it was where I would truly be reborn. By the time the front doors banged open, I was standing at the very top of the stairs looking down. Arthur and Beatrice burst into the foyer, flanked by a gust of wind and rain. They were drenched, disheveled, and completely stripped of their aristocratic veneer. Arthur's bespoke Tom Ford suit was soaked, clinging to his trembling frame, and Beatrice's perfectly coiffed hair hung in wet, pathetic rat tails around her pale face. Behind them, stacked neatly by the front door, were 6 large Louis Vuitton suitcases. I had Maria pack them the moment the board meeting adjourned. "What is the meaning of this?" Beatrice shrieked, her voice echoing wildly in the cavernous space. She pointed a shaking finger at the luggage. "You insolent, treacherous little snake! You think you can throw us out of our own home?" Arthur didn't yell. He stared up at me, his eyes dark hollow and utterly unhinged. The mask of the polished, patronizing husband had completely melted away, revealing the violent, desperate coward underneath. He took a step toward the stairs. "Arthur, don't," I said. My voice wasn't a scream. It was a calm, authoritative command that floated down to them like a falling leaf. "You ruined me," he growled, taking another step. "You took my company. You took my money. You humiliated my mother. I am going to wring your pathetic little neck." "The company was never yours, Arthur. It was a house of cards, built on my father's money," I replied, folding my arms. "And this house isn't yours either. Not anymore." Beatrice let out a bark of hysterical laughter. "You are delusional. The deed to this estate is in the Sterling Family Trust." "It was," I corrected her gently. "Until Arthur used it as collateral to secure a secondary shadow loan to pay off Vivian Croft's demands last month. When the board fired him this morning, that loan went into immediate default. The creditor claimed the asset." Arthur froze, his foot hovering over the 3rd step. "The creditor," he whispered, his mind racing to put the pieces together. "Prescott LLC, I said, offering a small, razor-sharp smile. "A blind holding company operated by Finch and Associates, completely funded by the Hayes Family Trust. I bought your debt, Arthur, which means I own this house, and you are currently trespassing on my property." The silence that followed was different from all the others. It wasn't the silence of confusion or the silence of tension. It was the absolute crushing silence of total defeat. But a cornered animal is the most dangerous kind. Arthur let out a guttural, terrifying roar. He didn't care about the money anymore. He only cared about the humiliation. He charged up the marble stairs, taking them 2 at a time. His hands outstretched, his face contorted in a mask of pure, murderous rage. This was the moment. This was the exact choreography of my previous death. The push, the fall, the crunch of bone. I didn't move. I didn't flinch. I kept my eyes locked on his, watching the exact moment he realized he had made a fatal error. From the shadows of the 2nd-floor gallery, 2 men in dark suits stepped forward. They weren't butlers. They were private security contractors Alistair had hired from a firm consisting entirely of former Metropolitan Police. Before Arthur could get within 3 feet of me, the larger of the 2 men, a broad-shouldered ex-sergeant named Miller, intercepted him. Miller grabbed Arthur by the lapels of his soaked suit, spun him around with brutal efficiency, and slammed him face first into the plaster wall. "Arthur Sterling!" A new voice echoed from the bottom of the stairs. Detective Chief Inspector Davies of Scotland Yard's Fraud Squad stepped out of the adjoining drawing room holding a plastic badge wallet. 2 uniformed officers flanked him. I had invited them in for coffee 30 minutes ago, handing over the unredacted ledgers. "You are under arrest for corporate embezzlement wire fraud and the misappropriation of trust funds." DCI Davies recited, his voice devoid of any sympathy. "You do not have to say anything, but it may harm your defense if you do not mention when questioned something which you later rely on in court." Arthur was weeping now, a pathetic high-pitched whimpering sound, as Miller pulled his arms behind his back, and the uniformed officer snapped the steel handcuffs around his wrists. "Mother!" Arthur cried out, his face pressed against the wall. "Mother, do something!" Beatrice was paralyzed at the bottom of the stairs. She looked from her handcuffed son to the detectives, and finally up to me. The matriarch of Kensington Grove, the woman who had made it her life's mission to make me feel small, insignificant, and crazy, was now hyperventilating, clutching her chest. Mrs. Beatrice Sterling." DCI Davies continued walking toward her. "You are also under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud and accessory to embezzlement." "No!" Beatrice gasped, stumbling backward. "No, I am a Sterling. You cannot do this to me. I demand to speak to my lawyer. Clara, tell them you're lying." I looked down at them from the landing. The view was spectacular. "Officers," I said softly, my voice perfectly steady, "please remove these trespassers from my home. The noise is giving me a terrible headache." The fall of the Sterling Empire was the most publicized scandal in London's financial sector that year. The tabloids dubbed it the Canary Wharf collapse. The trials were swift and merciless. Without the Hayes Trust to pay for elite defense attorneys, Arthur and Beatrice were appointed public counsel. I attended the sentencing wearing a tailored midnight blue Chanel suit, a subtle nod to the night I broke Vivian. Arthur was sentenced to 8 years in a high-security facility. When the judge read the verdict, Arthur didn't look at his mother. He looked at me sitting in the gallery. His eyes begged for a reaction, a smirk, a sneer, a tear, anything to validate his existence. I gave him nothing. I simply held his gaze with a serene, empty stillness until the bailiffs dragged him away. Beatrice received 5 years. The stress of the trial stripped of her Botox, her caviar, and her sycophants aged her 2 decades. The society circles she had ruthlessly dominated abandoned her overnight. Eleanor Gable made sure of it, ensuring that the Sterling name became synonymous with vulgarity and theft. As for Vivian Croft, her boutique PR firm folded within a month. No respectable business would hire the woman whose public drunkenness and financial ties to a convicted embezzler had made the front pages. The last I heard, she had moved back to the Midlands, working a mid-level marketing job under a fake name, forever looking over her shoulder. Dr. Henrik Faber quietly surrendered his medical license and fled to Dubai to avoid prosecution. His lucrative London practice completely dissolved. I didn't have to lift a finger to destroy them. I merely handed them the rope, and their own greed, arrogance, and cruelty tied the noose. It was a crisp autumn morning when I finally finished redecorating the Kensington estate. I had gutted the house. The heavy, oppressive mahogany furniture Beatrice loved was burned in the fireplaces. The dark, brooding oil paintings of Sterling ancestors were auctioned off for charity. The house was now filled with light minimalist art and life. Alistair Finch dropped by for a celebratory lunch. We sat in the newly renovated sunroom drinking a remarkably dry Chablis, a wine Beatrice would have undoubtedly called vulgar. "You know Clara?" Alistair said, leaning back in his chair and observing me over the rim of his glass. "When you first came to my office, I thought you were making a terrible mistake. I thought they would crush you. I have never been so happy to be wrong. They tried," I said, tracing the condensation on my glass. "But they made a fatal assumption. They thought because I was quiet, I was weak. They didn't realize that noise is just a distraction. Real power doesn't need to shout." Alistair smiled warmly. "And what will you do now? The Hayes Trust is double what it was. You have the estate. You have your freedom. You have your whole life ahead of you." I think, I replied, taking a slow sip of the wine. I'm going to enjoy the quiet. After Alistair left, I walked through the empty sunlit halls of my home. I stopped in the foyer and looked at the grand marble staircase. The ghosts of my past, the shattered ribs, the gaslighting, the tears, the desperate pleas for love from people incapable of giving it were gone. They had been thoroughly surgically excised from reality. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. There was no smell of Chanel number 19. There were no hushed, passive-aggressive whispers. There was no Arthur sighing in disappointment. There was only silence. Beautiful, victorious, absolute silence. And for the first time in 2 lifetimes, I was entirely at peace. If my story taught you anything, let it be this: never mistake a person's silence for submission. Toxic people thrive on your reactions. They feed on your tears, your anger, and your desperate attempts to defend yourself. When you stop giving them the noise they crave, you starve them. You force them to sit in the deafening echo of their own terrible behavior, and eventually, that echo will tear them apart. You don't have to scream to win a war. Sometimes, the most lethal weapon you possess is simply stepping out of the way and letting them fall. If this story resonated with you, or if you've ever had to take your power back from someone who tried to break you, please drop a like, hit that subscribe button, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Your support helps bring more true life stories of revenge and resilience to the channel. Until next time, protect your peace and stay silent when it counts.